Welcome everyone to SaaScast, the podcast that talks you through the steps you need to future-proof your product, whether that's building the ultimate marketing team or taking your products global. Our guests will help you grow, scale up, and work smarter.
Hi, Georg. Thank you so much for joining us on SaaScast today.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks. It's great to be here.
So before we get started today then with the main discussion, I think our listeners would just really benefit from hearing a little bit more about you, your background, and your kind of journey to your current position, and also what it is kind of about this particular path, in SaaS that sort of fills you with excitement and drive.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, I have been in or around SaaS since 2007. So I started my career at Microsoft and was perhaps by some combination of luck and hard work in the right place at the right time, and ended up being the first quota-carrying person at Microsoft in Europe for what is today Office 365, and it was called something else then. And we did these very early big deals, moving people's Exchange and SharePoint workloads into Microsoft's data centers in 2007, 2008. Back when the idea of moving big enterprise workloads to the cloud was even more challenging than it is today. It's pretty accepted today. So it started for me then, and I went to, after really enjoying a few years at Microsoft doing that, and it scaled to Office 365, and there were thousands of people involved with it, to a small startup called Yammer, which was, I think, Series B funded at the time, with a team of folks in the US. Myself and two others met in a pub in London Bridge, and we founded the European team. And 18 months later, we had 85 people in a beautiful office in Shoreditch, and Microsoft acquired the company. So I found myself back again at Microsoft with my old friends. And we had a very, very good integration process. I spent a year being part of that and really enjoyed that, actually, before going off again with some of the Yammer executives to a small video company where I spent just a few months. That didn't form as large part of my story, but we were competing with Zoom at the time, and that was good learning experience. And then I went to Tesla, which was a little deviation from SaaS, but actually in terms of pace, had just as much going on as any software company of whatever size I've been involved with. So that was great fun. I ran first the UK, then Western Europe for Tesla, and did that for just over 4 years before going to my first CEO position in an education technology business where we did child safety, which was a company called Smoothwall based in the UK, backed by private equity, which we sold in 2021 to an Australian business listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. And I'm still a non-exec director there, so I've stayed involved, which is quite fun. And that business was called Family Zone, although it's rebranded itself now to Qoria with a Q. So Qoria does child safety technology right around the world, big in the US, big in Europe, and of course in Australia as well. And so I found myself entering the language technology industry in early 2022, which is my first time involved in language technology. Phrase is also backed by private equity, so there's a sort of common thread there, and a second time CEO position for me. And what do I love about SaaS and frankly technology in general? It just is forever changing. I mean, I love that it's different year on year. I love that we're pushing boundaries of technology. I, sometimes to my detriment, enjoy fiddling with new things. And, my kids call me Gadget Man because I've got, health monitors on both wrists. And I love to geek out on that, but I also love the way these businesses run. They're very customer centric. We sell and we're in renewal cycles constantly because they're subscription businesses. And I think that drives a kind of customer focus and orientation, which I really enjoy. It means that people like me don't just sit behind a desk, and we get out and we meet customers, and that's important. So yeah, that's my drive. I get to work with really smart people on some really cool technology with an amazing customer base. I mean, I'm very lucky to do what I do.
Have you always been fascinated by technology then, since you were a kind of a student or younger?
Yes. Yeah. I was always into computers when I was a kid. I never really learned to program. I mean, I tried, but it wasn't really my strength. I remember doing some sort of easy basic type stuff. I thought I could predict the weather by looking out the window and taking a record every day, and then writing some basic rules based. That didn't get me very far. But I remember writing websites when I was at university. Again, I wasn't particularly good at it, but I wrote the website for our summer ball at university and things like that. So it started young. Yeah, for sure.
You say it wasn't very impressive. I mean, just trying that out is pretty impressive, I think, at that age. But yeah, it's great that you come with that perspective of, having seen it, having been here a long time as well, and having seen it evolve, and having seen how, like you said, I love how you said that SaaS is kind of, it's put the customer more in focus. I think is one of the great things about it. One of the things I love about it as well is I think that it's kind of brought in a kind of diversity of talent. I think that perhaps wasn't there before, because there's so many different industries and seeing the potential in this in SaaS, I think, and with that, I think you get people. We need our kind of techie people, obviously, but you get people who come from more humanitarian backgrounds, education, like you said, and I just think the more talent, the better. Really,
I'll give you two examples. When I was at Yammer, I hired a young woman who was had been a professional ballerina or on that track before an injury curtailed that career. And I remember when we interviewed her, I said, "What this young woman can't teach us about hard work isn't worth knowing." And we've just recently at Phrase hired someone who until not long ago was a carpenter and retrained. We're not his first job in SaaS, we're his second job in SaaS. But I think it goes to your point that it can attract a broader talent pool.
Definitely, yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so let's go into our discussion today then, and I want to refer back as a point of reference to an article that you recently wrote for us at Future of SaaS on localization, which I know is that's what your solution provides, isn't it? Essentially, and I was just wondering, can you elaborate on the mechanisms through which localization contributes to improve financial performances? Because we're always talking about kind of growth, and and obviously you went into it in the article, but I think it would be great to sort of elaborate on it further. Like, what is it about it that has the potential to make SaaS companies more profitable?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of the value drivers for localization focus on two areas, product and marketing. As I think we'll explore in some of the conversation today, I actually believe that there's some untapped potential outside of those areas, but particularly around kind of growth and go-to-market. It's really one of the areas that localization is most often thought about. So it might be about how one localizes one's website and the shopping cart and the product descriptions and the product manuals and all of that stuff that helps a customer to understand the value that one is actually providing, and then to help support and service that. And we've done some research ourselves, we've cribbed other people's research. So, for example, ChargeBee, which is a sort of pricing SaaS business that has a lot of very good data on tens of thousands of SaaS companies. They produced a report recently with Price Intelligently, which states, quote, "Companies with deeper localization frameworks grow at a higher rate than those who don't." It's pretty black and white. So growth, I'd say some other data we have from Harvard Business Review and other CSA research and IMSI and others says things like customers are more than half of customers are likely to prize the opportunity to obtain information in a language of their own choice more highly than price. So actually more focused on being able to consume the content in language they understand than necessarily paying the lowest price, which must be music to CFO's ear. 3/4 of consumers say they're more likely to purchase the same brand again, so repurchase, if the customer care is in their language. And more than 80% of customers say they're more likely to buy a product in the first place. So you've got conversion metrics, repeat purchase metrics, and then customer service concerns is another area, like, are people getting the care that they want? And then the final metric, which I thought was interesting from CSA research, says that even very large companies are leaving as much as 54% of their total addressable market untouched because they're under addressing the opportunity of localization. And you only have to look at some very large brands, very large software companies that either only sell in the US or only sell in English, or the US and one other language. So I was talking to one multi-billion dollar software business recently, which is in English and Japanese, and not in French and German and Spanish and Italian and Chinese and all the other languages that might, open their markets up.
So what's holding people back then, do you think? Like, why are people not capitalizing on this? And Is there some good logic behind it? Are there certain companies that perhaps it wouldn't be worth their while, or?
Well, do you know what? I think a lot of companies that grow in the US start their business in the US. And so perhaps naturally they become quite large in one language. And so, fair enough. Companies that grow in Europe often become multilingual and localize more quickly. However, I think that gives context rather than an explanation. I think business executives underestimate the complexity. So it's not unusual for a business executive to say, at the end of a process, right now that we've done all this work of developing this new product or marketing campaign or whatever it might be, now can we have that in 7 languages, please? We want to launch, next quarter. At which point, anyone who knows anything about localization sort of rolls their eyes because it just isn't that straightforward. So I think the complexity is underestimated. I do think the opportunity is perhaps underestimated as well. That you can't just roll out in English language and go to other countries around the world and expect that consumers are going to engage with what you're doing. So I think there's a bit of underappreciation and undersimplification. And then the final thing I think is that, as I say, a lot of the focus historically has been on these kind of growth metrics, which are important. There are other areas of untapped opportunity that executives could be looking at, and I think might need a little, pointing in the right direction.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So let's go a little bit more into this complexity then, because I think some people, when they hear localization, they might just think, what is that translation? Is that what we're talking about here? What is the difference with localization? What do we mean when we talk about that?
So translating is the straightforward act of taking a set of words and directly translating them. So if you were translating the phrase, it's raining cats and dogs into another language, you would just literally translate the words. Localizing is to understand that has a specific meaning and there might be a reasonable alternative. And I actually, there's a fantastic Wikipedia page, if you Google it, where they provide equivalent expressions to raining cats and dogs for lots of other languages. And there's all sorts, in Estonian, raining as if poured from a bucket, or raining like from a beanstalk. I'm just going down the list here. In French, raining nails. In German, raining young dogs, like raining puppies. I mean, I suppose it's related to cats and dogs, but it's not the same thing. So there's quite a lot of funny ones here. But the point is, that's what localization is. There's another layer to this, which is globalization, which is actually the act of preparing your software, for example, to be ready to adopt this. So one of the reasons of complexity, for example, might be that historically software businesses might hard code a language into the user interface. So on a button, it hard codes the text on the button. Now, what you need to do actually is have a variable there, so you can call that variable from a table according to the language selection that you make. And if you've written a million lines of code with hard coding, to go back and change all of that is potentially quite hard work. So that's another layer for people to consider. But yeah, hopefully that helps explain localization.
Yeah, definitely. I love what you're saying about the different phrases and how they don't translate as well. I think it's so important, isn't it, as well? I mean, what we talk about a lot on Future of SaaS at the moment, customer success is really popular as a subject. I suppose like the kind of proactive customer service as opposed to kind of reactive. And this seems like, in a way, a kind of an example of that, like proactivity in a way. Like, how do you provide exceptional service to customers? It's not just about, pressing a translate button, but I suppose understanding them in their culture as well. I mean, I suppose with the true localization strategy as well, you'd have to become a little bit attuned and aware of cultural differences as well. And as well, it would have to be a completely different way of thinking almost sometimes, I think, in certain cultures.
Well, that's right. So it does go beyond language. It goes to imagery, for example. So if you are using imagery in the Middle East, then you might portray clothing and dress in a different way to imagery in South America, and so on and so forth. So it is more than language. It goes to tone and formality, for example. Some markets are more formal, and some languages, of course, use different vocabulary depending on the formality. Some languages have very different vocabulary depending on your use of plurals. So, and genders, not like some languages have more than two genders, hard coded in the language, leaving, any politics aside. It's just that there are so many different ways of expressing these concepts than we are used to in English, which is relatively binary in many respects. I was told, I don't speak Russian, but I was told, for example, in English we talk about one and many, but the Russian language has a concept of a sort of middle ground of few, which then actually repeats itself. So you have, like, how to explain it, you have, as you go through the decades, 10, 20, 30, 40, you have like 10 and a bit, or 10 and a few, or 10 and many. I'm probably explaining that very badly. And again, it was sort of explained to me firsthand.
Yeah.
There are different concepts.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely certain cultures prefer a more formal approach, I think. Business agreements, others, like, I don't know, if you're talking to more of a kind of Silicon Valley type environment, I think probably then, it's become more normalized now, hasn't it, to sort of treat the customer like a friend almost, is that kind of atmosphere as well. So there's so many different things you have to take into account, I think. It's really interesting. So you were talking about diversification across different markets and in this article. So I was wondering, can you share some specific strategies for CFOs and CEOs? How can you effectively diversify your market presence?
So there's maybe a few ways for people to think about it. So one obvious one is simply to open abroad, but I would describe that as growing your audiences, because that can be abroad or at home. So many countries have large diaspora populations. The UK has many diaspora populations. The US, well, I think Spanish may even have overtaken English as the number one spoken language in the US. In Canada, there are multiple official languages. In Belgium, there are multiple official languages, and so on. So the first thing I'd say is language is about expanding your audience beyond the first language you begin in, which can, of course, also then take you abroad, but it may even just expand your audience in the countries you're already in. The second thing that can happen there is that you start picking up an audience from that diaspora abroad that you didn't actually necessarily aim to target in the first place. It's just that they have seen that you offer your service in their language, and they will therefore go to you in the place that they are now in, because the internet opens it up globally. I'd say, so growth is a clear one. That is important in terms of geographic revenue growth, and also diversifying the product portfolio. There are some other perhaps less obvious examples. So let's talk about hiring talent. If you want to hire talent from around the world, and then you want to train that talent, and you are only doing so in one language, you're limiting your talent pool, even if you're using one of the major languages. And a great example of this is one of our engineering company customers, who they do lifts and elevators and things like that. So they send field service engineers to repair these things in 70 plus countries around the world. And they currently only provide all that material in one language, in English. And so if they are hiring a local based field service engineer in Kuala Lumpur or Rio de Janeiro, or I don't know, Quebec, they're insisting that, well, they are limiting themselves to people who are English language speakers. And if you could open that up to local language speakers, then both the CFO, the VP of Field Service Engineering, and the Chief People Officer are all going to be very happy at having a more diverse, broader, and probably a lower cost talent pool to be able to go to. So it's kind of an interesting, non-obvious example, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I like that as well. We're going back again to diversifying the talent pool. I think that's something that goes hand in hand with remote work as well these days. I think that's another. We're gonna get on in a bit to like sort of the future of SaaS tech as well. And I was wondering, like, I think that's a great example how something like what you're talking about, localization, that people might not have thought of, could go hand in hand with other developments like remote work or AI or something like that. It's sort of how you can achieve synergy behind all these things. Now maybe you've got someone working in, I don't know, an office in South Africa who happens to be the best person for the job, whom you wouldn't have found 20 or 25 years ago, because the work culture was just so different. I think that's really interesting as well.
Absolutely. And then the learning and development support that you can give people as well, because I mean, there are countless studies that tell us what's already, I think, obvious, which is that one learns better in one's native language. And so if we can, localize the sales materials, the management training materials, the onboarding materials, then I think we're going to have people ramp up faster. I think we're going to have better managers, drive higher employee retention rates, and people are going to feel like their careers are supported in a way that isn't going to be equally true if we're only doing everything in a single language.
Yeah, certainly. I think so. I think, and there probably have been instances in the past, I think, of a language barrier, creating blocks for internal communication, I'd imagine. So it's great that we sort of have these solutions in place now where we can start to get around that, because like you said, you're not necessarily going to find the best talent for your job for whatever role you're offering where you are. It's crazy in a way that you would think that, out of all the people in the world that you could potentially find one quote nearby, it's sort of like the world is big, and now we have it all open to us.
Yes.
It's fascinating, really. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about customer retention and customer loyalty in particular. We talk a lot about in Future of SaaS about retention and how retention is often a cheaper strategy than acquisition, and that it's kind of I suppose it's the key to achieving like kind of sustainable growth rather than having a kind of leaky bucket kind of growth, right? So let's talk about localization then in relation to this. What do you think is the kind of effect that it has on people when they see that a brand, has these things in place to communicate with them? Like, what do you think is going to be the effect?
Well, I think it's very important. If you go to Asia and you're only in the English language, you're not going to get nearly as far as if you can provide sales, marketing, of course, to start with, but then also help center, training materials, certifications, partner channel, materials in a local language. And so I was in Japan in March. It was my first trip to the country, and we were hosted by our Japanese general manager for Asia. And it was a wonderful experience. And he explained to me that only 1% of Japanese speak English. And so, it was just quite striking, really. And then if you go to other markets around the world, maybe there's a greater percentage of people that speak English. But nevertheless, you are going to be limiting yourself if you only do it in that one language. And it's going to feel like this is a visitor. It's not going to feel like this is a company that has invested and is here for the long haul. So when it comes to retention, if people are making selections about, is this frictionless? Is this easy? Or am I having to work at this? And does this company feel like it's invested in my country? Are they going to stick around? They haven't even made the effort to translate the content. I think that really speaks a lot to people when they're making those types of decisions.
You know what I'm reminded of? Maybe this is way off base, but I'm thinking of like how when you get ads on the television or even on, if you're watching YouTube or something that have been brought over to the UK, and you can tell it's an American ad. Yes. But they've dubbed it with British accents.
Yes.
And that's really, really interesting. And apparently I saw some research on that said that, however falsely, so there's a bit of a prejudice in some people's minds that they think that if they're not hearing it, not just in their language, but with the accent, they somehow don't deem it as trustworthy. Somehow,
I think that's absolutely right. And if you go to, we're in this country, of course, in the UK, we mostly do get like local language advertisements, except in the case you just mentioned where it's US coming over. But if you go to the continent, they're getting a lot of English or US, which is like just straightforward dubbed across, and the voices and the lips don't make any sense at all. So it's it's even worse outside of our experience here, and it does erode trust. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's something that we've always kind of known. I feel like it's interesting how like often these like old marketing principles, sometimes it takes a while to reintegrate them. But I feel like the old truths usually are true. They usually hold out, they usually survive, I think.
They do. And I think, like, instinctively, people will know that. Business executives will know that. I think there's maybe two reasons that we've not talked. Well, one we've sort of talked about, and one we haven't. Why people don't just get it right first time every time. But and the first one is probably because they underestimate the complexity, and so at the last minute they're saying just do something. And the second thing is it's historically been perhaps too expensive to localize all the content. So companies have been selective about what types of content they localize, and this is where I think the technology is really changing things dramatically through machine translation, in particular through artificial intelligence, which really does change the game in terms of driving down the costs and opening up the types of content for which the economic hurdle is now achievable in terms of localizing and broadening it out.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So something that was perhaps not a worthwhile investment a while ago is becoming worthwhile because of new technology, because it's relatively cheaper now. It's something that's worth taking the risk, because obviously there's always going to be some kind of risk, isn't there, with something like this, I think.
Yeah, very, very much so. I think a lot of large companies will have a dedicated localization team. Now, that team will have technology like ours, which they do to manage these types of complex processes, and they do it at scale, often millions and millions, tens of millions of words a year. But then what can still happen is that divisions or, teams that are spread around the world, either for a particular piece of content, it's too expensive or too slow to go to the central team. And so they either do nothing and do it in, they don't localize it, or they might, contribute to a shadow localization budget where they go off to a local freelancer and just get it done quietly on the side. That happens all the time. So just like shadow IT exists, shadow localization also exists in these large companies. And often the central teams we speak to tell me about all the, the time and effort they go to sort of grab these outliers and bring them back to the center. Now, technology like ours and some things we've released relatively recently actually make it much cheaper and much easier for even folks on the periphery, if you like, to get high quality machine translation through. And therefore, they no longer need to find workarounds or do nothing. They can actually inexpensively get a great outcome. And so I think that sort of thing really makes a difference as well.
Definitely. One thing that's just occurred to me, Georg, is I'm thinking about like brand presence now. And what I was thinking about is how I suppose organizations want their brand to be somewhat consistent. How, like, I don't know, again, I'm referring to things that are non-tech, but like how like McDonald's has the golden arch, right? Like it's sort of like you want to have a consistent image, don't you, right across the world? How does that fit with localization then? What adaptations do you have to make when sort of translating your brand abroad, whilst also achieving that sort of consistency? Yeah. I wonder if there, of any case studies or anything where, like, where there have been challenges with that kind of thing. So.
Well, it's an incredibly important point, because of course, if you don't have some sort of standards or control or do localization properly, what sort of thing might happen? Well, people might just go to Google Translate or the internet, or their, friend from school who speaks a little smattering of some language and say, can you help me with this? And what happens is you get these very poor quality translations, and as a result of poor quality translation, you get poor quality localization. And then that can be incredibly embarrassing. It can also happen algorithmically. And there was a horrible case of this with Kentucky Fried Chicken recently in Germany, where they had a sort of algorithmic approach where they would send out social media congratulations for public holidays. But then one of the public holidays in Germany was actually a commemoration for some of the events of the 20th century. And so KFC suddenly sent out, a social media present celebration for one of the most terrific, nights of the 1930s in Germany, which, clearly not the sort of thing that a human in their right mind would have done. But the machine just, followed the rules and didn't apply intelligence to it. And so that was a pretty nasty case. And they had to come and apologize and say, look, deeply sorry for all the offense that we did cause. So, it is important to do these things with a bit of thoughtfulness and use the correct technology. And then, of course, you can do these things with high quality and at scale. But as much as we're a software business and we're purely a software SaaS business, we still believe there is a role for the human being, even if artificial intelligence is going to reduce the percentage of intervention by humans. It's also my belief that generative AI and so on is going to increase the volumes of machine translated content dramatically. And so, the sort of absolute amount of intervention by humans may be maintained even if the percentage reduces.
Yeah, well, let's get into it then. I was gonna start opening up to future of SaaS tech developments, but I think we've arrived at AI already, like everyone invariably does. Because how can you have any conversation about technology without getting into AI now? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I just want to know if you'd elaborate further on your opinion, like what you hear all the horror stories, and you've just told me a horror story, I think, right there. What is the role of AI then in the future of technology? Is it to kind of augment what we have already? What do you see it? How do you see it playing a big role? Is it going to touch everything? What areas can it not touch? Let's get into it.
Yeah. I think AI will touch everything. I think clearly some of the recent advances have been changing how people perceive the potential for AI dramatically. And so suddenly through ChatGPT and other generative AI, whether it's image or music and so on, people are saying, well, this is extraordinary, mind-blowing, what a cool demo. I think there's been already a little bit of a hype cycle there, in that there was a tremendous amount of excitement and nervousness around that, and some of that has cooled. Because I think what people are seeing is that these large language models do some really extraordinary things. However, they can't be left alone. You can't say to the large language model, please come up with a new tagline for this new product idea. Please write all of the copy. Please disseminate that copy in all the languages. You just can't trust it to do all that in almost at any stage, right? And one of the reasons is that they are highly probabilistic, meaning you can press the generate button 10 times and get 10 different versions. So there's no guarantee that the first version is going to be good. And if you then ask the machine to do it natively in 50 languages on the first click of the button, well, you have no idea, unless you speak those 50 languages, whether or not it's actually done it correctly. So I think generative AI is incredibly exciting. It's a huge productivity boost. I think that's what we're going to see with AI in lots and lots of ways, whether it's in predicting the next word I want to type on my phone so that I have to click the keyboard fewer times. That's a form of AI, through to changing completely the nature of internet search, which it already is doing for me. But at the same time, for business purposes, it needs a tremendous amount of control. So we've solved some problems and we've introduced whole new ones, which are really kind of fascinating. So yeah, largely it's productivity. Largely that means people can do more with less. It also means people with, in the nicest possible way, less talent can do more. You no longer need to be a world-class software engineer to write world-class code. You could write mediocre code and have the Copilot improve it for you. So that's pretty interesting. And I think that will create some perhaps flattening of the curve of salaries, for example, which might have been extremely weighted to the top end for, the top 0.1% of software engineers. That might get sort of flattened out a little bit. On the other hand, I don't think it suddenly, like flattens it completely. But same thing could be said in a number of different areas around any business. So it's a productivity enhancer for all of us.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me as well. I think that somebody mentioned to me that, people talk about productivity, it can obviously get more and more things out. And I thought, well, there's a concern, isn't there? I think with some people that it will lead to great productivity, but less thoughtfulness, I think is the worry. I suppose maybe a counter argument to that could be that maybe it allows those really high skilled people that you were talking about, maybe it allows them time away a little bit to think.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, maybe they're not coding as often. Maybe they can come up with more strategies They can think more, and they can think about the future more. I think one of the things in the working day maybe that stops people is just having to do a lot of tiresome kind of like admin stuff that really is below their skill level, perhaps, you know?
Yeah, I think you've hit on something very important. I really like how you put it, that it might result in sort of, how do you say, doing more but in a less thoughtful way.
Yes,
and
yeah.
I think that's absolutely the risk, and probably in the early waves of adoption there will be lots of that. I think we'll adapt. I tend not to believe I'm 42, so I've been in SaaS for 20 years, and as a result I've seen a few sort of promises of productivity enhancements, which mean we're all going to have to sort of work less because we can do so much more. And actually, that's not been my experience. I don't think any of us have worked less over the last 20 years. Potentially it's gone the other way, right? Suddenly work comes with you everywhere. But what I think it has done is allow us to your point, work on the higher value stuff, because it doesn't take us so long to do mundane things. And so I think that's what we'll see with this too, which is that if even top quality engineers are now able to write, I don't know, 1,000 lines of code a day instead of 100 or whatever the right, metric might be, what they'll do is they'll be able to step back and look at that 1,000 lines in a way that previously they could only look at 100, and they'll be able to see a sort of bigger picture. And then I think the technology will also do a lot of the analysis to help them understand the implications of what you've just done are. And that's where the thoughtfulness will come back in, and that's why the salary curve won't be completely flattened, because the most creative and brilliant minds will still be able to see things others don't. But I do think we'll see. I'll give you maybe one example from some of our customers. We have several customers in the travel booking industry, let's say, and sort of as a result, they have lots of reviews and review sites. And a lot of that kind of user-generated content is now machine translated. It simply doesn't need a human being to touch it at all. Right. And then what sometimes they will do is they'll use workflow to write rules to say, well, if this particular piece of content gets above a certain threshold in terms of views, then let's have a human being just do a quick double check. And you could see that being applied to all sorts of things like help center articles, frankly, even news stories, which is to say, let's build some thresholds in here for machine only, machine with a quick review, human takes the lead, and build that across large parts of our workflow. And that's where I think there are quite important things here. AI on its own is going to generate actually enormous complexity, because it's going to generate so much content. We're going to be able to do so much more with less, and that will ultimately lead to chaos unless you have some really good workflow that says, I've set a threshold for trusting that to the machines, another threshold for some workflow that involves a human being, another threshold for human only. We're doing quality checks at every stage, which have to be automated, but they need tweaking. And I'm sort of bouncing around topics a little bit here, but you get to things like machine learning operations, right? It's a big area, because data quality and model drift, these are terms people are going to hear more and more about. So if just a quick definition on something like model drift, short, like Idiot's Guide is, you ask it the same question 3 days in a row and it gives you increasingly worse answers. And that has been happening across even some of the very big models, right? They drift and the answers get worse over time.
Okay. Why does that happen? I don't quite understand that.
Yeah. So a lot of models are trained on the data you give them. So if you have a very specific, very narrow data set, you'll probably get much less drift and very high quality answers. If you train a large language model on, all of the internet, and then those large language models start also contributing to the internet. Now they're being trained on a model which they have been contributing to, which means you get these echoes, this feedback. Right. And then what can happen is, like, the internet isn't always right. People can, there's obviously disinformation or misinformation, which can be deliberate or accidental. These things get picked up and incorporated into the answers, and then you get these echoes of false answers coming through. And then I'll give you an example I saw recently, which I think has been fixed because it became a quick meme. Someone asked ChatGPT if it takes one, the old, I don't know if you've heard the saying before, but if it takes one woman 9 months to make a baby, how long does it take 9 women to make a baby?
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT answered 1 month.
Right. Okay.
Now, I think that was subsequently fixed, or it depended a little bit on how you asked the question. And that's the other thing, is you and I might think we're asking the same question, but asking slightly different ways. And it sort of, triggers the AI to give slightly different answers. And we won't necessarily know why.
Yeah. I've found as well, because I've used ChatGPT a fair bit, experimented with it, and I feel like it is crap in, crap out. Really, it's like it's all about what, to use a crude expression, it's all about like if you tell it like what it's sort of, so say for example you're putting some content out there, if you tell them what the purpose is and what the target audience is and who's going to be seeing this and what you want them to do exactly when they see it, I find that you get better answers as well.
Yeah.
I feel like it's people, I think, who complain about it sometimes are people who don't really know how to use it. I think there's definitely a bit of a skill to learning how to input the information.
Yeah.
And I think it isn't too dissimilar in a way to telling, like if you were telling like a marketer to do a marketing task, you couldn't just say, write this copy. You'd have to tell them, they'd have to know what was the purpose of it. What do you want people to do with this? So I think in a way people sometimes treat this software as kind of like a foreign thing or a new thing, but the way you put information in, I actually think I found it's not that dissimilar from how you would communicate with a person. Interestingly,
it's absolutely right. And it's sometimes when people say to me, for example, if you're in the world of localization and these generative AIs can write copy in 50 language natively, doesn't that mean that localization is not required anymore? And I'd say, no, actually, it's almost the opposite, because in the past, a human being would have briefed a copywriter who would write a version that would then be translated. But before it was translated, it would be checked. So the copywriter would say, are you happy with this?
Mm-hmm.
Now what's happening is a human being is briefing a machine that is natively producing content in 50 languages, which means, are you checking the 50 languages? You might check the original language and say, oh, I don't like that. So now can you, the machine, retranslate them into the other 50 languages and sort of go that way? But actually what you're doing is you're just basically shifting the problem along and actually making it bigger, particularly if you're using generative AI because you want to do more faster, which means that any mistake that you make is going to get amplified. And machines make mistakes at a scale even faster than humans make mistakes, of course, when they make them. Which is kind of interesting. So yeah, we've got definitely into the philosophy of it, but it's an exciting time. That's the thing. We're definitely going through the sort of if there's an S curve to this, we're going through an acceleration period now, and how we all learn and think about this and adopt it.
I think that as well. I mean, I think we've gotten past the fear stage a bit. Actually, I think at one point we were in the fear stage, and now I think people are getting quite excited about it again.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably the case with any development. I mean, you will know because you've been in technology for such a long time. I think with any new development that comes in, there's the fear stage, isn't there? Which is just a natural human response. Like the Stanley Kubrick film with the sort of apes looking at the big monolith, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like when it arrives, that kind of thing. And then, there's kind of then there's the excitement stage when you realize what you can do with it, or like, seeing fire for the first time. And I think sorry, go on.
I think that's right. But do you know what? I think it would be great for the audience to take away is, I'd say, do all the pub conversation around, how it's going to change the world, but then bring it back to the tiny, small incremental improvements you can put in your workflow or your product today. And then you're going to get real value today. Like, simple example, we work with one of the big ride-hailing apps, right? I can't say the name, but a big ride-hailing app. And not all the drivers have English as a first language, and they can measure the difference between deploying to drivers in their native language and to the customers in their native language versus not in terms of repeat engagement. And in a highly competitive space, supply-demand market, like ride-hailing apps, getting a few extra percentage points of loyalty from the drivers. And that is a really simple, and it's machine translation, really simple real-world example of how you drive loyalty. And that's, so I'd say to the audience, do all the thinking in the blue sky and get ready. And, because it's important, because we are on an S-curve. So if you put your head in the sand, you'll be way behind a few months down the line, et cetera, et cetera. But there are practical, real-world things you can do today with language and AI.
That's great to hear. Yeah. So before we round this off, then, is there anything else that you think is a major development that is perhaps a little bit unsung or being eclipsed by AI a little bit at the moment?
I suspect we'll see security be a major area again over the next few, because with AI and generative AI comes false, fake news and deep fake and all that kind of stuff.
Deep fakes, yeah, that's scary.
So I think we'll see deep fakes be used for nefarious purposes. I'm sure they already are, quite frankly. And so I suspect there'll be a second wave associated with that, sort of around authenticity. But
I suppose that with the risk that comes with these things, that forces new advancements, doesn't it? That's what you hope, is that like the risk that comes with one development pushes the evolution of another in a way.
Yes, it does. And security will be a good thing, because if people can trust it, they'll use it. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely going to be a great thing for SaaS companies, I think, is that improved. Yeah, definitely. And especially when you're thinking about customer trust, how important it is now for SaaS companies to create that trust with the individual and create that relationship.
Yeah,
it's indispensable, isn't it?
It is.
I think.
I mean, and we've all had those, phishing emails. And one of the ways it's a phishing email is because it's written really badly. So, like, another simple example: poor quality localization just turns people off.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, this has been really great, Georg. Thank you. Before we round off today, if people want to reach out to you, more insights, how should they reach you?
Email works. So first name dot last name. So Georg, Georg.ell @phrase.com. I'm also at Mr. Georg Ell on Twitter. So either of those is pretty good. Or write to me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I'm sure people are really going to benefit from this. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you today. And I think this has been a really vital discussion.
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate it. It's fun.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of SaaScast. For more top insights from the leading minds in SaaS, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a thing.